Hi, good day. This is Mr. Shadrack with the Shadrack Safety Institute, coming at you with another NEBOSH tutorial session for the Diploma in Occupational Safety and Health. This lesson is more in line with Chapter 4 of the textbook, and what I've decided to do, it's to cover just part of this chapter with this presentation. Really hoping to keep these videos maybe down to about half an hour to 45 minutes for the most, right? Chapter 4 is a bit of a longer chapter. So if you have your textbooks, basically around page 87 will be where you'll find the start of this. Now what I intend to do, I would want to cover just about 2 to 3 concepts in this video and perhaps tie in a past paper with it, right? So let's go straight into it. I would be directing you to certain pages in your book so that you can follow through on, and those that are quite easier, I would just do the explanation and direct you to the pages as well, right? Let's get into the first piece of it. So, summary of this session, hazardous substances, and again that's the name of the chapter anyway, monitoring and maintenance of control measures and measuring of airborne contaminants. So, there's some stuff there already, but just to point in the right direction here, that there is about 2 main ideas in this chapter. One of it is what you're looking at on this slide, biological monitoring, and the other would be, just hazardous substance monitoring. So as this gets started in your book on page 87, what you should be seeing is the concept of the workplace exposure limits. Again, we have actually done that already, I believe, in chapter 1. A really good idea if you take a look at your book there, page 87, 88. 88 in fact would have a definition for the term workplace exposure limits. So you can probably just refresh that a bit. For those who have never seen that before, you can simply just put that in Google. WEL would be the acronym, and you want to just get the definition for workplace exposure limits. I could give you one here, I probably would say one, but of course it would be better for you to find one on the HSE website. So typically what you want to see for the workplace exposure limit is that these would have been set by the health and safety executive, and what they represent is the concentration of airborne contaminants that a person can breathe, over a specified time period without having any ill health effects. There are 2 time periods mentioned in the workplace exposure limits, and what that means is that there would have been 2 figures published as a limit. One would have been what is called a short-term exposure limit, and the other would be a long-term exposure limits. The unit can be in parts per million, ppm, or milligram per meter cube. So you can look at that a bit, and that would be some research from, I guess, chapter 1, and again, those who have never done that before, I get a bit on the internet. So what I have here first on this slide though would have been a bit on biological monitoring, right? This in your chapter though, as I mentioned, is 2 concepts, 2 main concepts. It would have been biological monitoring, and this is actually found almost to the end of your chapter. So if you have your books, I do have mine with me here, this would almost be the last pages of chapter 4. You'll find a bit on biological monitoring, right? I'm seeing here roughly page 115, 114, biological monitoring, and again page 116 is really the end of the chapter. So biological monitoring is concerned with the measurement, assessment of hazardous substances or their metabolism in tissues, secretion, excreta, or expired air. Biological monitoring is different from atmospheric monitoring, as how much a person has typically inhaled and the harm done. Right? So biological monitoring, of course, inhaled there in inverted commas, could actually be not just what was inhaled, but what was absorbed through the skin, etc. Right? But it's not just what would have been, you know, inhaled per se. That would really be the workplace exposure limit. But biological monitoring would refer to, you know, what gets into the body, right? And it could be measured, for example, in your secretions, expired air, urine, etc. Right? So biological monitoring can be obtained from blood samples, urine samples, hair and nail samples, X-ray, lung function tests, and breath samples. Why develop a monitoring strategy, right? So I think this could be asked for both of the monitoring strategies. When I say both, I mean the biological monitoring strategy as well as your typical, you know, like air or hazardous substances in the air monitoring strategy. So why do that? They say it could be part of your health risk assessment. It could be used to demonstrate compliance with the workplace exposure limits, towards the design of exposure control measures, checking the effectiveness of existing control measures, right? So again, I could think of many reasons for doing monitoring. I mean, one is that we want to inform the employees of the hazards then that they could be facing, whether they be from biological agents or from hazardous agents in the air per se, right? Why develop a monitoring strategy? Informing employees of the pattern of exposure and the level of risk, to indicate the need for health surveillance, establishing in-house exposure standards where necessary for insurance purposes, and to contribute to epidemiological studies, right? So you know, again, each of these have their own explanation, but you can think of some, I guess, on your own, right? I guess some of the easier ones would be, you know, a company would want to establish, their own in-house exposure standard. So, for example, it would have the published workplace exposure limits per se, and then they can try to go maybe just below the workplace exposure limits. In that case, then the company's in-house exposure standard would probably be better than the workplace exposure limit, right? The last one is very interesting. You would get the information, for example, if we talk about biological monitoring here, you get the information from, urine samples, lung samples, mucus, secretions, etc. That could let you know from folks who may have passed on, what would have been the cause of that. So to contribute to epidemiological studies, right? I saw a really good one, coming out of the coronavirus, that the world is going through right now, where they are trying to use those individuals who would have recovered, those who would have had the virus and recovered. They're trying to use blood samples from those individuals. They're asking them to contribute, their blood samples, and they're extracting the antibodies from those blood samples and hopefully using it for patients that are, in the intensive care unit. So definitely to contribute to epidemiological studies. Legal requirements for monitoring. So you should remember this again from lesson 3. COSH being the main law here for chemical and chemical agents. It is a requirement under regulations 10. You can do a read of the rest of this here. I will most likely have to send you this lesson via email sometime later down this week. Alright, so legal requirement for monitoring, regulation 10 of COSH This states that monitoring is required when failure or deterioration of the control measures could result in a serious health effect. Measurement is necessary to ensure that an workplace exposure limit or any self-imposed working standard is not exceeded, or necessary as an additional check on the effectiveness of any control measures, provided in accordance with Regulation 7 and always in a case of the substance or process specified in Schedule 4 of the regulation. And just in case you don't know that schedule of COSH, the regulation, it's about carcinogens and mutagens, etc. So definitely in those cases you want to do monitoring. Peak level measurement involve monitoring, and so I would explain some of this. So this is typically the two types of measurements that you can use. I want to say two type really. This is really, I really want to say more for the hazardous substances, and what they can do, they can measure the individual personal sampling or static measurement. Static measurement here would have been on the workplace. A good example of static measurement is that one of the detectors, if you know any of them by name, maybe some sort of stain tube detectors, and those are not very accurate anyway, but again, that is what I came up with here. Could be placed, for example, on a railing on a piece of equipment in the workplace itself. It's not on the individual, it's not placed on the individual's clothes or collar or clip-on in any way. It is placed on the work equipment itself, and for that reason, for example, a railing, a fence per se, it is referred to as static monitoring, right? May involve successive samples to be taken, or where the hazardous substance can be monitored using a direct reading instruments. And direct reading instruments are much better than the one I mentioned there, the stain tube detector, right? Static sampling aims to assess the effectiveness of engineering controls of emissions into the workplace by identifying likely sources of contamination from processes. The sampling equipment is placed at fixed location, for example like a fence, a guardrail. Location should be strategically selected to provide the most useful information regarding the principal contaminants emitted into the environment. Peak sampling and static measurement. So as I mentioned, this is what I wanted to explain. This whole couple of slides is basically saying that as you sample for the length of the day, then there could be many things that affect the concentration of contaminants that you get. It could be, for example, that on a particular day there have been more work being done, so then on that day, or maybe if you want to think of it as in that hour, you will find that in that hour of the day you find more work being done, so then you may get more contaminants during that particular hour, right? So there are many reasons why you can get peak levels using both personal and static measurements anyway, right? So down in that slide, and to summarize that anyway, right? So here you have an exposure pattern for a working shift for 8 hours, and then you can see task 1 concentration in parts per million, but again you would see fluctuations. And again, this could be the start of the process, and then somewhere here, I guess to the peak of the curves, is when you can find that the most contaminants are being released. And again, you'll have periods of decline, and then periods of increase and fluctuation as well. So this is quite common, and again, not too much of graph questions though, but they can ask though, like, why is this the case? Like, why when you get different readings, for example, for the week, right? This was that Friday had the most amount of contaminants being released, and again, this could be due to resources and manpower, right? And then you get different fluctuations as you go throughout the course of the week, right? So I do have some of that, on the slides coming up anyway, right? So just to tie in this one here from your textbook, the role of the occupational hygienist: prevents the ill health caused by work environment, assists the employer and employee to estimate the risks to health and to minimize or eliminate them, conduct monitoring of hazardous substances to implement a suitable monitoring strategy. Role of occupational hygienists: occupational hygienists can come from many backgrounds such as chemists, engineers, biologists, physicists, doctors drawing up a rehabilitation program for return to work, nurses monitoring and recording sickness, physiotherapists, the assessment of the physical capabilities of the employees to carry out a task either pre-employment or after return to work, ergonomists giving advice to management and control for manual handling tasks, right? So that was actually in the textbook there. Right, so I think we are back. The app just did what it did again and dropped there, right? So just to maybe repeat the last one, several individuals doing similar jobs may be simultaneously monitored. Right, let's to the next slide. So personal sampling: a number of variables affect the airborne concentration of contaminants in the workplace, including number of sources from which the contaminant is released, rate of release from each source, type and position of each source, dispersion or mixing of contaminants in the air or the workroom by ventilation, movement, or turbulence in the air. Ambient conditions, particularly for outside operations, where factors such as direction and air temperature are important. An individual exposure will depend on how close he or she is to the various sources of and the length of time spent in the contaminated area. This may vary from day to day and from one worker to another, although their jobs may appear to be similar in nature. Right? For example, shift work anyway. The main variations which have to be considered include between shifts, between sessions, between individuals, just to summarize that one there. Remember, substances hazardous to health can enter the body by ingestion and skin absorption as well as by inhalation. This means that in some situations you may also need to measure the total amount of a substance that has entered an employee's body. This is done using a technique called biological monitoring. Biological monitoring is outside the scope of HSG 173. However, though it is in the syllabus, right? Just to let you know that biological monitoring is in the syllabus, and HSG 173 really talks about hazardous substance in the air monitoring rate. So biological monitoring in the workplace, guidance and its practical application, HSG 167, right? So I really want to do some explanations here, right? So just trying to make some sense out of this here. At least the best way for exam anyway, right? I think I'll skip this. Not seeing anything here that we haven't touched on before. HSC guidance 173 will be the one we're going to look at now. So on biological monitoring, you would have gotten that from your textbook itself, right? The textbook definition and the one I gave at the start as well. Right, so let's move on. This would have been what I wanted to end the session with, just looking at the time. 20 minutes, just about half an hour, and then the past papers. So HSG 173, strategies for sampling. So what you need to know, and again I would have done this way at the beginning, just decided to read through some slides. I should have done this at the start, but then that's where the slides went anyway. Right, so this would be the strategy for monitoring hazardous substances. You can find on page 90, and on page 91 there's a nice flow chart which we have reproduced on the slides coming up. So this is in accordance with the cost regulations for an employer to set up a monitoring strategy. Now just bear in mind, again, time doesn't permit me to talk about all of them, but I did mention two so far. The two main ones that have been monitoring, which is outside the scope of HSG 173, and we are looking at HSG 173 now, which is really hazardous substance in the air monitoring. So what is proposed here is really a 3-phase plan of monitoring for hazardous substances in the air, and the 3 phases of it, you see it here, would have been initial appraisal, basic survey, and detailed survey. So let me just pause and see if we can find that in your textbook. It's actually page 92 and 93 that has this outlined really nicely in your textbook. Alright, so page 92 again and page 93 would have had this laid out really nice with bullet points in your textbook. So again, what I'll try to do is the explanation. So what you need to know is, again, this is just one type of monitoring, which is hazardous substance in the air monitoring. Of course that may involve some biological, if you know all of it anyway, but basically it's hazardous substance in the air monitoring, and it's 3 phases of the same strategy. So it's not really, I really wouldn't want to think of it as 3 different strategies. It's really 3 phases of that one strategy anyway, right? So we have initial appraisal, and again this is, for example, the employer, the safety, they are trying to find out what is the hazardous substance in the air and how is it affecting the workers, and what they can do. If you look at it, what the initial appraisal does, the initial appraisal reveals what are the hazards, what are the potential risks, and everything to be done about it. So when you think about this, a lot that goes into the initial appraisal is really, for example, like the risk assessments, like the health risk assessments, can be what you do to get the initial appraisal, to know, for example, what are the chemicals and what are the hazards in the chemicals. So this is the idea here. Typically anything you can find in a health risk assessment is what you'd want to say makes up the initial appraisal. For example, you can have in it the number of individuals that was exposed, the groups of workers that were exposed, the number, type, and location of says work being done, how long was the work being for, what type of PE was given to the workers, etc. So typically what I find here would be the information, as I mentioned, on a health risk assessment. Also find some basic ideas of an initial appraisal. This would have all been part of the health risk assessment anyway, that the employer would have used, for example, maybe the occupational hygienist, and they may have done some basic monitoring. They may have used, for example, like a dust lamp to indicate that there is the presence of dust, the tidal beam. They may have used a stain tube detector to maybe let them know that there is a particular contaminant in the workplace. Okay, next. we have the basic survey, right? So this will be required when the initial appraisal suggests that there is an exposure risk, but the extent of the risk is uncertain. Major changes have been made to the process, procedures, or control measures since the last assessment. Unusual or periodic operations are planned. New processes is being commissioned, or a new workplace exposure limit or in-house standard has been set. Basic survey estimates employees' personal exposure and provides an indication of the efficiency of the process and engineering controls. So that is really good there. A big way in which the basic survey differs from the initial survey is that the initial survey would have known the risk. The basic survey, if the risk is still yet unknown, you'd want to suggest a basic survey be done. And then a big difference here is that the basic survey estimates the employee's personal exposure. Now that's a big hint there as to what type of equipment or maybe the level of detail that can go into a basic survey. Second point, in the case of a basic survey, it is best to look at worst case situations such as the dirtiest or situation employees make the most complaints about before monitoring those employees likely to be at significant risk of exposure. Need to be identified, or a significant risk of exposure needs to be identified along with the conditions giving rise to the exposure. The next illustrates the factors that influence airborne concentration. Semi-quantitative methods can be used to estimate personal exposure. These give a rough numerical estimate of exposure. Some semi-quantitative methods are comparatively inexpensive and easy to use. For example, stain tube detectors, organic vapors, photoionization detectors, PID, portable gas chromatography, the GC there, and infrared analyzers. So, as I would have mentioned, don't know how much of this you all know, but I really don't want to cover the type of equipment in this lesson. It's already getting to half an hour. I can do that in another lesson. The main idea here though is that basic survey is more detailed than the initial appraisal. Right? The initial appraisal study hazards and the risks and the controls. The basic survey is if they did not know fully what was the risk, right? They could then go on to do a basic survey. And if we just look at, for example, the first one here, a stain tube detector, this is a really inexpensive tube that can be placed on the worker collar badge, right? That is attached onto the worker's clothing. And one end of it is actually broken, and the stain tube has on it measurements, or should I, it has been graduated, and it has been graduated to give on it readings. So what the stain tube has on it or in it, it's normally like a chemical, and a chemical crystal, or in the form of crystals anyway, and that chemical normally would stay then, or it would actually spread inside of the tube once and a known concentration of air enters through that tube. What it does, it pulls the chemical in the tube, sort of like the breathalyzer anyway, and then they can find the difference between the point at which the chemical was at in the tube to the point at which it would have, been stretched onto anyway. So you could find out a rough estimate of the exposure. For example, maybe you're using that for, maybe ammonia, right? And then they could get a rough idea of what the concentration of ammonia is in the atmosphere, then to estimate maybe the risk of the workers being exposed to ammonia. So you find that the basic survey is a little bit more, detailed. They did mention some semi-quantitative methods, right? Not purely quantitative methods could be used, right, to determine the risk anyway if it's unknown after the initial appraisal, right? So I'll move on. So I think I'll skip this one. We would have mentioned, what could influence airborne concentration of contaminants, right? Work being done, processes, and maybe the LEV system not functioning the way it should be, the extraction fan not functioning the way it should be. It could result in excess contaminants in the workplace. So this survey may highlight defects, deficiencies, and control strategies. Based on this and information gathered during the initial appraisal, the conclusion that control of inhalation risk is acceptable. If the conclusion is not certain, there are two options. Carry out now what is called a more detailed survey and take remedial action as necessary, or right there at the end of the basic survey, take direct action to control exposure. So if it is found out, for example, that the concentration of ammonia has been more than the set limit, they will take direct action, at the same time. They would possibly use, eliminate, substitute engineering controls at the same time, because you would have been close to, right, the workplace exposure limit. Those calculations do reveal that you are close to or just above it. Then you need to take action as soon as possible, right? So that strategy, and I would stop just after this one. So detailed survey, this is undertaken when the extent and pattern of exposure cannot be confidently assessed by basic survey. Exposure is highly variable between employees doing similar tasks. The substance is a carcinogen or a respiratory sensitizer. You need to do a detailed survey for those. The initial appraisal of the survey suggests that the time-weighted person and exposure may be very close to the workplace exposure limit, limits from another body or in-house standards, and the cost of additional measures cannot be justified. So it may have been that you are very close to the workplace exposure limit or the limit set by another, entity, as well as maybe very close to your own in-house standards being exceeded. Without evidence of extent of exposure variability and undertaking major maintenance on one-off jobs such as plant decommissioning. Alright, a detailed survey is suited to complex processes and will require an in-depth investigation of this and its environment. For example, now just as I go into this here, I'll tell you that a detailed survey is, in the simplest way to say it, and really for exam, because we haven't really reflected on those as yet, a detailed survey would have in it what the initial appraisal has in it, as well as what your basic survey would have had in it, plus more. So you'd want to start by probably saying that you want to consider in a detailed survey the hazards, the risks, the controls, the number of persons affected, the duration of exposure, the health risk assessment, readings and recordings you'd have gotten from the basic survey, such as maybe using the tail beam, the lamp, right, the dust lamp, maybe using the stain tube detectors. All of those will make up evidence and documents that you can find in a detailed survey. So maybe to throw out one question here, maybe what would be 10 items, 10 of information that makes up a detailed survey. So you can get them from the initial appraisal as well as the basic survey, plus you can add more technical means of measurement then, right? So take it from the bullet points here: procedures involved in the process, work practices being used, maintenance procedures including the type and frequency, control measures in use and their suitability, protective equipment provided to employees and its suitability, previous monitoring results of health surveillance program, indication and instruction provided to employees for carrying on the task involved, and the extent of the training provided to employees. Right? Details that usually requires more specialist knowledge than an initial appraisal or basic survey. It is beyond the scope of HSG 173 to describe such a procedure in full, especially as details vary from or with the situation in each workplace. For certain circumstances, a detailed survey may need to include the use of biological monitoring. So you could have seen the whole of this entire chart is in your textbook. Not too sure what happened when I put the larger view there. So, and get that slide right. So, right. So this is on page 91 of your textbook. Generally 3 phases of monitoring, but remember this is hazardous air monitoring. Start initial appraisal. You want to get what are the hazards and risks. Do you think exposure is under control? No. Remember it's hazard control. You move to the basic survey. From the initial appraisal and basic survey, decide the level is acceptable. Let's go with the no. Need more information. And again, here you can actually get some semi-quantitative techniques used. For example, the tidal beam, the dust lamp as we call it, safety detectors. But then if still you are uncertain, you move on to a detailed survey, right? And this is using all the information from the previous plus more detailed monitoring measurements. And that is the lesson I said I'll come to in another session. It's actually in your textbook as well, for example, using different types of filters and different types of monitoring badges, using microscopy and gas chromatography and whatever have you. So I'll leave that for another lesson. I would want to possibly, if I could, I'm not too sure how this will all anyway, right? Because a bit of this had some research in it, right? So there was a question, so I'm going to stop here. There was a question, I'll try to find it for you now. There was a question as I clicked this off, right? So there was a question that mentioned biological monitoring, and the question had given an extract from the EH40 book, right? I had asked you all before to try to find that book, right? The EH40 document that is published from the HSE website, right? So I think it was July 2017 would have been that question, right? And please remember that this does have a bit of research in it, and that if you did not go in the first class we had, if you did not go and get EH40 as yet, you would need, to do so anyway. Right. So let's see if this goes right. So right. So I think it's just about number 4 or 5 around there anyway. Right? Okay, so it's number number 5. Right, so question 5, information related to the solvent butane-2-ol in the health and safety executive document EH40 is as follows. So this is an extract of the book, right? EH40, you can get it from Google anyway. And they have given you here a snapshot of butane 2-one. The CAS number, we look at the top of it, the work accident, which would have the long-term exposure limit for hours, and then the short-term exposure limit also for 15 minutes, right? At this time here, what you have is some acronyms. They have SP and then BMGV, right? So the first piece of this question, July 2017, isn't it? Identify what BMGV stands for. Give the meaning of the phrase, the term, workplace exposure. Outline why butane 2-one has been assigned both a exposure limit and a BMGV in EH40. And part D, outline the legal difference between workplace exposure limit and the BMGV. So, hopefully you all had the book, and this is what I keep coming back to, right? So the book typically is like this, right? EH40, that is anyway, in that some substances, they have both the workplace exposure limit and then they have a biological value as well, right? So when we get into that, maybe in another session, you'll actually know that there's actually two types of biological units there as well. But I'll stick to this question here. So identify what BMGV stands for, and I'll just say it anyway. It stands for, I could probably get here for you, it stands for biological monitoring guidance values, right? So the data's yet, right? So okay, so it's here. So most candidates are able to completely give completely accurate answers to part A, and therefore were awarded 1 mark for identifying BMGV stands for biological monitoring guidance values. If you don't quite know, I guess know it as yet, please you could memorize that. But also know that there are already two types of those readings that are already published, right? So one would really be like a health figure. That's the one that I really want to focus on, maybe more for everyday life. I'm trying to find the page at the same time, right? So you really want to get the health value, the health figure, because that is the one that could, I guess, mean that you are, if you stay below that figure there, then it means that then your health will be protected, right? So if you would have done, let's say, personal biological monitoring, let's say of your breast, urine samples, secretion, etc., and then there's a standard published for that, right? Let's say, and these things are normally in parts per million, right? Let's say 5,000 parts per million would have been for the BMGV for butane 2-one, but then your measurement is still at about 1 part per million, and that would have been, I think, quite safe anyway, right? I mean, if the standard is so high, and in your work area, the urine samples, whatever they were tested for, it comes back to be just about 1 point something. It meant that you are quite safe anyway, right? So part B of it, give the meaning of the term workplace exposure limit. So I had given that at the start of the presentation. So again, I think this is on right around page 87, 88, not quite sure. But what you want to say is that it represents the figures published by the HSE in the document EH40. What it represents is the average concentration of airborne contaminants that workers could inhale over a specified time period, be it 8 hours or 15 minutes, without having any, ill health effects anyway, right? Part C, outline butane 2-one has been assigned both a workplace exposure limit and a BMGV value in EH40, but there could only be one reason, or one main reason, right, that you need to bill out anyway, which would have been that the substance, butane could be in the air, then it could exist as a hazardous substance in the air. So it could be inhaled, but it could also be absorbed, which is why it has absorbed through the skin, which is why they have on the label the SK note there, right? So it would have been the workplace exposure is what would have been in the air to be inhaled. So this substance then could exist in different forms. It exists in the gaseous form, and it could be inhaled, but it could be absorbed by the skin. So therefore it has been given a skin notation as well as a BMGV value, meaning it could be absorbed by the skin and cause its ill health effect. I'll probably find that line for you there. Right. So this extract of insulin demonstrated that solvent has the potential to be inhaled and therefore has been assigned a workplace exposure limit, and it can also be absorbed through the skin, so it is assigned the SK notation. Simply controlling exposure via one of these possible routes of entry would not be sufficient to adequately control the overall risk of exposure, right? So that is what you build on to get that format there. The last part of it outlines the legal differences between workplace exposure limits and BMGV figures, right? Because the V stands for way, right? And the main difference there is that workplace exposure limits are a legal requirement under COSH, and more so it's more like in support of, it's more on the level of an approved code of practice. So the approved codes of practices can be used as evidence in court so that you are not compliant with a standard. In a way, the workplace exposure limit has legal, standing. But again, if we repeat what BMGV stands for, it stands for Biological Monitoring Guidance. And of course, remember your work from level 3 or from unit A, guidances don't have any legal standing. They represent best practices at the time of publication, but they are not really legal documents to say that, right? So I would stop this one here, and we would put on out as soon as we are able to. Right, let me just try it officially. Right, close this one off, right? So so that's it there for this one. Again, just about 50 minutes into this one with the past paper. It's in no way completed, but then these lessons, these were really meant to go over a month, right? I mean, the longer chapters, like chapter 4, would have taken us 4 Saturdays anyway, right? And that would have been over 3 hours of teaching. So, the situation out there is getting a bit more technical, right? I'm not too sure with regards to the office opening hours. So, we would let you all know on the WhatsApp group as to what's going on with that, right? Again, feel free to send your particles. Once I get, the chance now, I would be able to correct them, and I will send you back those via email or probably via a scan, right? So take a go at this one. It did have a bit of skipping with this one as well. So hopefully it came across well enough, to kind of get you to go into your book to get, I guess the rest of it, right? So I'll see you all possibly the end of this week again, when I will do another one, or maybe the rest of it. And it wouldn't really be the rest of it because it would be another piece of it, to wrap up this whole chapter anyway, right? All the best, folks. Bye.